There's something avoidants know about themselves that they will take to their grave before admitting to you. Most people focus on understanding why avoidants push people away, why they sabotage relationships, why they run from intimacy, but those are just symptoms of something much more fundamental that drives their entire approach to human connection. The real issue runs much deeper. There's one fundamental truth about avoidance that explains almost everything about their behavior, a truth they're aware of, consciously or unconsciously, but will never voluntarily admit because it would shatter the carefully constructed identity they've spent years building. They need you. They need your presence, your attention, your care, in ways that go far beyond what they'll ever acknowledge, and this terrifies them because their whole sense of self is built around the mythology of not needing anyone. Think about how they talk about themselves when they describe their past relationships, how they explain why they're single or why things didn't work out with previous partners. There's always this underlying theme. Other people are too needy, too clingy, too dependent. Other people want too much, demand too much, expect too much emotional availability and connection. They position themselves as the reasonable one, the independent one, the person who doesn't require constant validation or attention to function in the world. But here's what they don't tell you. They've become completely dependent on being seen as independent. Every single behavior that makes them seem self-sufficient, emotionally unavailable, or above the messy complications of human attachment is actually a carefully constructed defense against this one devastating truth about their inner world. They're not actually stronger than you, they're not more evolved or mature or capable of handling life alone than the average person who openly acknowledges their need for connection. They're terrified. Terrified of needing someone in a way that makes them vulnerable to disappointment, rejection, or abandonment. Terrified of depending on another person's choices for their emotional well-being. Terrified of admitting that beneath all that cool detachment lives someone who craves connection just as desperately as anyone else, maybe more desperately because they've been denying that need for so long. Because while you've learned to acknowledge your needs, to ask for support when you're struggling, to admit when you want reassurance or closeness, they've spent years convincing themselves and everyone around them that they're above such basic human requirements. But here's what they'll never tell you. Every time you pulled away, every time you gave them the space they claimed to need, every time you respected their boundaries around independence, it didn't just give them relief. It panicked them, not because they wanted you closer in that moment, but because they realized how much they'd grown to depend on your presence, your attention, your love being consistently available to them. And that realization is their worst nightmare because it means they're not actually the emotionally superior beings they've convinced themselves they are. But avoidants can't just admit they need people and move on with their lives because that would require dismantling the entire psychological framework they've constructed to protect themselves from the vulnerability that comes with genuine human connection. That would be too simple. Instead, they've constructed an elaborate lie to protect themselves from this truth, a lie so fundamental to their identity that questioning it feels like psychological death. The lie is this: I don't need anyone because I'm stronger, more emotionally evolved, and more capable of handling life independently than most people who get caught up in the messy complications of relationships. They tell themselves they're more mature than people who need emotional support, validation, or consistent connection from others. In their minds, other people are weak for needing reassurance when someone pulls away, immature for wanting to talk through conflicts instead of just moving on, or overly sensitive for getting hurt when someone becomes emotionally unavailable. They see themselves as the exception to basic human psychology. The ones who have transcended the need for interdependence that seems to control everyone else's decisions and emotional reactions. This isn't conscious arrogance, by the way, and it's not intentional cruelty toward people who are more emotionally open than they are. Most avoidants genuinely believe this narrative about themselves because they've convinced themselves so thoroughly that their emotional detachment is a form of wisdom rather than a wound that never properly healed. They point to their ability to handle breakups well as proof of their emotional superiority to people who struggle with loss. They pride themselves on not being clingy, or needy, like their exes who wanted more time, attention, or emotional availability than they were willing to give. They mistake their inability to form deep attachments for sophisticated insight about how relationships should actually work. But here's what they refuse to acknowledge: their independence isn't strength in any meaningful sense. It's fear dressed up as strength. Real strength would be admitting they need people and learning to navigate that need in healthy ways that don't compromise their sense of self. Real emotional maturity would be recognizing that interdependence is actually more evolved than the kind of isolation they've mistaken for independence. Real wisdom would be understanding that vulnerability and need aren't character flaws to be overcome. They're what make us human, and denying them doesn't make you superior. It just makes you disconnected from fundamental aspects of the human experience. Instead, they've created a false hierarchy where emotional self-sufficiency sits at the top, and anyone who openly needs others sits below them in terms of psychological development. This hierarchy serves a crucial psychological function. It allows them to feel superior to the very people they desperately wish they could be like, people who can love freely without constant fear of what that love might cost them. The truth they guard even more fiercely than their need for connection is what they're actually afraid of, and it's not what most people assume when they try to understand avoidant behavior. It's not abandonment, though that's what most people think and what avoidants often let people believe because it sounds more sympathetic and less revealing about their actual psychological patterns. What they really fear is being found out. Being discovered as someone who isn't as emotionally strong, independent, or psychologically evolved as they've spent years convincing everyone, including themselves, that they are. Being seen as ordinary, flawed, and needy in the same ways that they judge other people for being. Avoidants have spent years cultivating an image of themselves as uniquely self-sufficient, as people who have transcended the basic human needs that seem to control everyone else's behavior in relationships. They've built their identity around being the person who doesn't need what everyone else needs, and they're terrified that if you get too close, if you see past the carefully maintained facade, you'll realize that their emotional detachment isn't wisdom about relationships. It's sophisticated avoidance of the very experiences that create real intimacy. You'll notice that their independence isn't actually strength. It's fear of depending on anyone for anything that matters to their emotional well-being. You'll discover that their ability to handle difficult situations without seeming affected isn't resilience. It's emotional numbing that prevents them from processing experiences in ways that lead to genuine growth. This is why they sabotage relationships precisely when things start to get serious, not because they don't want commitment in theory, but because commitment means being truly known by another person. And being truly known means risking exposure of all the ways they're not actually as emotionally superior as they pretend to be. They can handle being left by someone who never really knew them because they've prepared for that possibility their entire lives. What they can't handle is being seen for who they really are underneath all the performance and then being left anyway. Because if someone leaves after really knowing them, after seeing past their walls and understanding their fears and witnessing their actual personality without the careful curation, it confirms their deepest terror, that they're not actually worth staying for when all the mystery and emotional unavailability is stripped away. So they leave first, or they create conditions that make you want to leave before you can see too much. Better to be abandoned for their walls than to be abandoned for their authentic selves, because at least then they can tell themselves that the rejection wasn't really about them. It was about the barriers they put up. This fear of being found out drives almost every confusing behavior they exhibit in relationships. Here's what avoidants will never tell you about love. They think it's a trap designed to make intelligent people do unintelligent things, and they've convinced themselves they're too psychologically sophisticated to fall into it. Not love in the romantic, swept-away sense that movies portray, but love as a psychological mechanism that makes people weak, dependent, and ultimately disappointed when reality doesn't match their emotional investment. They've observed people in love making decisions that seem completely irrational to them, staying in relationships that clearly aren't perfect instead of moving on to find something better. fighting for someone who doesn't seem to appreciate their efforts instead of finding someone who values them naturally, getting hurt by someone's behavior and then going back for more instead of protecting themselves from further disappointment. To avoidance, this looks like voluntary stupidity, like watching intelligent people suddenly lose their ability to think clearly because they've become emotionally compromised. They see love as something that makes rational people do irrational things, that causes them to compromise their independence, lower their standards, and tolerate behavior they would never accept from anyone else, all in the name of maintaining a connection that might not even be healthy for them. And they've decided they're too smart, too aware, too emotionally evolved to fall into that particular trap. But here's the contradiction they'll never acknowledge. They desperately want what they're rejecting with such intellectual superiority. They want to be able to love someone completely without the constant fear that love will make them vulnerable to pain they can't control. They want to be loved in return without having to perform or maintain walls or constantly manage how much of themselves they reveal. They want the connection, the intimacy, the partnership, the sense of being truly known and accepted that comes with real love. But they also want to maintain the safety of emotional detachment that has protected them from disappointment for so long. They want love without vulnerability, connection without risk, intimacy without the possibility of exposure that could lead to rejection. And since that's fundamentally impossible, since love by its very nature requires risk and vulnerability, they've convinced themselves that the problem is with love itself, not with their approach to it. They tell themselves that people who fall for love are naive about human nature and the inevitable disappointments that come with depending on another person. That healthy relationships require maintaining independence and emotional boundaries at all times, never allowing yourself to become truly dependent on another person's presence or choices. That anyone who truly needs their partner is settling for codependency instead of seeking the kind of mature relationship where both people remain completely self-sufficient. But what they're really saying is, I want to love you in a way that protects me from ever being hurt by you, and I can't understand why that approach doesn't create the deep connection I'm secretly craving. This is the hardest truth to hear, but understanding it will save you years of confusion about why your efforts to love them never seem to generate the gratitude or reciprocation you expected. Avoidants think you're weak for loving them, not consciously and not with deliberate malice, but somewhere in the depths of their psychology, your ability to love them despite their walls, their inconsistency, their emotional unavailability doesn't inspire the gratitude you might expect from someone receiving unconditional love. Instead, it inspires a subtle but persistent form of contempt. They respect people who are hard to get, people who maintain their independence even in relationships, people who don't seem to need them very much or make their emotional well-being dependent on the relationship's success, and they gradually lose respect for people who stay when treated poorly, people who fight for the relationship when it would be easier to walk away, people who keep trying to connect despite being consistently pushed away. In their minds, your persistence isn't evidence of love. It's evidence of desperation or low standards. Your willingness to work through their issues isn't patience or commitment. It's proof that you don't have better options available to you. Your dedication to the relationship isn't loyalty. It's fear of being alone disguised as romantic devotion. They would never say this out loud because they know it sounds horrible, and part of them recognizes that it's unfair to judge someone for loving them. But they can't help thinking, if I were in their position, I would have left by now, so why haven't they? What does their staying say about their self-respect and their ability to recognize when they're not being treated well? And instead of seeing your staying as evidence of your love and commitment, they see it as evidence of your weakness, your lack of options, or your inability to recognize your own worth. This creates a terrible psychological cycle. The more you prove your love by staying and fighting for the relationship, the less they respect you for it. The more you accept their behavior without walking away, the more they believe you must not have other choices or must not know what you deserve. The more you prioritize the relationship over your own needs, the more they assume you must need them more than they need you, which makes them feel powerful and simultaneously trapped. Powerful because they clearly hold more cards in the relationship, trapped because they know they're not treating you well, and your staying anyway makes them question your judgment about what constitutes acceptable treatment, which makes them question whether you're actually the kind of person they want to be with long term, someone who knows their worth and won't accept less than they deserve. This is why they often have more respect for exes who left them than for partners who stayed through difficult periods. The people who walked away maintained their mystery, their apparent strength, their standards. But you, by staying and trying to make it work despite their emotional unavailability, have revealed something about yourself that they can't unsee, that you'll accept less than you deserve in exchange for maintaining the connection. The final truth avoidance will never admit is the most devastating of all. They know their behavior destroys relationships, they understand exactly how their patterns hurt people, and they don't want to change any of it. Not because they enjoy hurting people or because they lack empathy for the pain they cause, but because their avoidant patterns serve them too well in ways they're not willing to give up. Being emotionally unavailable gives them power in relationships that they've grown comfortable wielding. Being hard to pin down keeps people interested and chasing, which feeds their need to feel desired without having to reciprocate that level of investment. Being unpredictable means they never have to meet consistent expectations or be held accountable for promises they make during moments of intimacy. Being detached means they never have to take full responsibility for anyone else's emotional well-being or happiness. Their avoidance isn't just a trauma response they can't help or a coping mechanism they've never learned to replace with healthier alternatives. It's a strategy that works exceptionally well for their goals, which are fundamentally different from the goals of people seeking genuine intimacy. It allows them to have relationships without the vulnerability, compromise, and emotional labor that relationships typically require from both parties. They get to be the pursued instead of the pursuer, the desired instead of the one openly desiring, the one with options instead of the one afraid of losing someone important. When people suggest they work on themselves or go to therapy or learn to be more emotionally available, they hear, "Give up all your advantages in relationships and become vulnerable like everyone else who gets hurt and disappointed." And they fundamentally don't want to do that, because they've seen what happens to people who love openly and invest fully in relationships. How they get hurt, disappointed, taken for granted by partners who don't match their level of emotional investment. They've watched people pour their hearts into relationships only to be left by someone who was less attached, less invested, more willing to walk away. And they've made a conscious or unconscious decision that they'd rather be the person with less to lose than the person with everything on the line emotionally. This is why they can seem to understand their patterns perfectly, acknowledge their issues with what appears to be genuine insight, even express remorse for their behavior in moments of clarity, but never actually change in any meaningful way, because understanding and changing are completely different things that require completely different levels of commitment. They understand that their behavior hurts people. They just don't want to risk being hurt themselves by changing it. They know their walls prevent real intimacy. They just value the protection those walls provide more than the connection they prevent. They recognize that their emotional unavailability drives people away. They just prefer being left for their walls than being left for their authentic selves, because at least the rejection of their walls doesn't feel personal. The most painful part of understanding this truth is that it means their behavior toward you was fundamentally a choice, not an inability or a limitation they couldn't overcome with enough love, patience, or understanding from you. Now that you understand these truths, you have a choice to make. You can continue hoping that understanding them will somehow change them, or you can accept that understanding someone's psychology doesn't make them capable of love in the way you need. Avoidants aren't broken people who need fixing through your love and patience. They're people who have chosen emotional safety over emotional intimacy, and they're not planning to change that equation because it serves them too well. They need you more than you need them, but they'll never admit it. They know their independence is really fear, but they'll never acknowledge it. They're terrified of being truly known, and they think less of you for loving them. They could change their patterns, but they won't, because those patterns give them advantages they're not willing to sacrifice. These aren't relationship problems to solve through better communication or more patience. There are fundamental incompatibilities between someone who wants real intimacy and someone who's committed to avoiding it. The question isn't whether they love you, they probably do, in their limited way. The question is whether their version of love, filtered through all these psychological barriers, is enough for you. Whether you can accept being needed but never having that need acknowledged. Whether you can love someone who judges you for loving them. Whether you can stay with someone who could be more present but chooses not to be. These truths hurt because they rob you of hope that things will change if you just love them enough. But they also free you to make decisions based on reality instead of potential. You deserve someone who sees your love as a gift rather than evidence of desperation, someone who wants to be known by you rather than hidden from you, someone who chooses vulnerability because they value connection more than control. If this video helped you understand what you've been experiencing, hit the like button so others can find these insights too. Share it with someone who needs to hear these truths about avoidant behavior. And let me know in the comments, which of these truths was the hardest to accept? Your perspective might help someone else struggling with the same realization. Thanks for watching, and remember, understanding someone isn't the same as accepting behavior that doesn't serve you. Block 7. What this means for you. Now that you know these truths, you have a choice to make. You can continue hoping that understanding them will somehow change them, or you can accept that understanding someone doesn't make them capable of love in the way you need. Avoidants aren't broken people who need fixing. They're people who have chosen emotional safety over emotional intimacy, and they're not planning to change that equation anytime soon. They need you more than you need them, but they'll never admit it. They know their independence is really fear, but they'll never acknowledge it. They're terrified of being truly known, but they'll never let you close enough to know them. They see love as a trap, but they'll never admit they want to fall into it. They think less of you for loving them, but they'll never tell you that. They could change their patterns, but they won't because those patterns serve them. These aren't relationship problems to solve. They're fundamental incompatibilities between someone who wants real intimacy and someone who's committed to avoiding it. The question isn't whether they love you, they probably do, in their limited way. The question is whether their version of love is enough for you, whether you can build a life with someone who will always hold part of themselves back. Whether you can accept being needed but never having that need acknowledged. Whether you can love someone who judges you for loving them. Whether you can stay with someone who could be more present but chooses not to be. These truths hurt because they rob you of hope that things will change if you just love them enough, understand them enough, or give them enough time. But they also free you to make decisions based on reality instead of potential, to stop trying to earn something they're not willing to give, to stop taking responsibility for their emotional unavailability, to stop believing that your love can heal wounds they don't want healed. The truth is, you deserve someone who doesn't need you to be weaker for them to feel strong, someone who sees your love as a gift, not as evidence of your desperation, someone who wants to be known by you, not hidden from you, someone who sees love as an opportunity, not a trap, someone who chooses vulnerability because they value connection more than control. These truths about avoidance aren't shared to make you angry or to demonize them. They're shared so you can stop wasting your energy trying to get water from a stone and start looking for someone who's actually capable of giving you the love you deserve. If this video helped you understand what you've been experiencing, hit the like button so others can find these insights too. Share it with someone who needs to hear these truths about avoidant behavior. And let me know in the comments, which of these truths was the hardest to accept? Your perspective might help someone else who's struggling with the same realization. Thanks for watching, and remember, understanding someone isn't the same as accepting behavior that doesn't serve you.